we are back. We're just going to switch the air conditioner off because I think it's creating background noise. So let's make sure that's switched on. Thank you for your comments, and it's great to know that we are audio sounding good, because our last session we had some real difficulty with the audio, and Donald and myself arrived here 2 hours early to make sure that we could get the audio sorted out. So I'm pleased that as we were at our ground state organising the audio, it worked. I'm quite pleased about it. Okay, I'm going to hand you back over to Roy now. I can see he's got his headset on his sector there. So all yours, Roy.
Yeah, thank you very much. So now I want to talk about some of the implications and applications of meta-reality. And I'll start by talking about two big topics, modernity and comparative religion and spirituality. But then I'll go on to more everyday topics, including conflict resolution and learning. When I wrote the meta-reality books, I was doing a lot of work in India, and I was asked to talk on globalization and the effects of globalization, but also in the context of an agenda which was driven by theories and ideas of, in some sense, modernizing India. So I was forced to develop a theory of the discourse of modernity, the philosophical discourse of modernity. And on this theory and understanding of modernity, I saw it as characterized by 5 phases. And each of the phases of modernity are associated with a big historical transformation or potential transformation. And I'll briefly talk about each of the 5 phases. But of course, modernity is strongly associated with 2 other big developments, Eurocentricity and capitalism. And these 3 ideologies arose at roughly the same time. And whereas the economists and may focus on capitalism, it's convenient for philosophers to look at notions of modernity, bearing in mind the capitalist and Eurocentric context of these ideas. So what is conceptually characteristic of modernity is a couple formed by atomistic egocentricity and abstract universality. The atomistic egocentricity places the ego, which is devoid of all characteristics, or all enduring characteristics, as in the subject pole, and the rest of the world is seen under the is seen in terms of abstract universals, not concrete universals. And there is a historical development at a conceptual level as well as a historical level in terms of institutions and ways of interacting, that is, in terms of four-planar social being. Now, another way to look at the defining characteristic of conceptually modernity is to think about the probably the most famous single saying in the philosophy, which is Descartes' cogito ergo sum, which means, of course, I think, therefore I am. And that's how he formulated the project of modern philosophy. And when we think about this, when we look at it, I think, therefore I am, we can see many of the characteristic errors and distortions of the discourse of modernity laid out very clearly. Thought is prior to being, which means epistemology is prior to ontology, which is, of course, the epistemic fallacy. And it's the thinking that is prioritized in a human being, not perhaps the emotions, love, or the body. So the human being is represented by thought. And then I think, therefore, I am. We have the priority of the I, the ego, over a society in which the ego is born, even placed prior to the other human beings, which were necessary conditions for them, their parents, and the people who looked after them and raised them. But more generally, of course, there's an individualism there which scouts a principle which is essential to critical realist philosophy of social science, which is that you don't have an I, you don't have an agency, unless you have a society, unless you have a social structure. Because the I, who might want to speak, must speak using a language, which is something they don't create, but something that is given to them, and which they reproduce and transform. So there's a very wrong individualism, prioritizing the individual over other individuals and over society, and then, of course, over other species. And this is very different from the world of pre-modernity. In the world of pre-modernity, peasants may have lived on the first floor of a building, but the cattle and animals lived on the ground floor. And metaphorically, they saw themselves as part of a chain of being, stretching from perhaps organic beings through, stretching from inorganic being through plants, animals, to human beings, to the enlightened ancestors, to angels, up to God or gods. And Descartes, on the other hand, and modernity generally, conceptualizes the world in which there is man, and it is a tacitly gendered man, and the object of his manipulations, which are machines. So there's no differentiation between animals and machines. So but this is giving you the flavor of the origins of the philosophical discourse of modernity. Now, the 5 phases. The first form of this philosophical discourse is the classical discourse, modernity. And this is associated with the English Civil War and 1640 to 16 and Revolution, 1660, and the French Revolution of 1789, the American Declaration of Independence. And then the next phase of the discourse of modernity, which I sketch out more fully, of course, in reflections on meta-reality, can be called high modernism. This is the world of Proust and Freud, and also Marx. And the two, there are a number of pivotal events. The revolutions, failed revolutions of 1848, and then later in the 19th century, up to the Russian Revolution of 1917. And then the third phase of modernity, and also the discourse of modernity, is associated particularly with what was called the theory of modernization. And this arose in the wake of the defeat of fascism in 1945, the Indian independence, but also partitioning of 1947, and the Chinese Revolution of 1949. And the kind of writings that are associated with it might be Rostay's theories of growth. And the idea here is that modernity and history develops in a unilateral way, unilinear way, and all societies must eventually get to the point that the leading nation is in. And of course, in the 20th century, the leading nation was the US. And this is still a prominent kind of phase and moment in the discourse of modernity. Then the fourth is postmodernism, and I see this very much as a form of the discourse of modernity, and this is associated with the events of 1968, the revolt of students and youth, and the new social movements are closely associated with this. And then the fifth form of discourse I've called bourgeois triumphalism, and this is associated with the defeat or demise of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc in 1989 to 91. And the idea now is that the superiority of Western society has been clearly established, and there is no need for any more big changes of any sort. And this is the doctrine of Fukuyama, and reverberates in accord with the ending of history that Hegel foresaw and claimed, in fact, that had been achieved in the Prussia of his day. And of course, we do know, like all such claims of endings, that it's wrong, because you have 9/11, 2002, the onset of the so-called War of Terror, 2008-9, 2007-8, sorry, economic financial crisis of a very severe kind. And all this suggests that perhaps we may be entering a distinctive sixth phase, which would be characterized by a new multipolarity. In 1989, for 10 years or so, there was a supremely hegemonic power, USA, and with the rise of the so-called BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and other newly emerging centers of power, there are a number of different models and poles of development and organization. Socialism may be on the ropes in Europe, but there are forms of socialism strongly developing in Latin America, for instance. Anyway, be that as it may, critical realism has developed in critique of the discourse of modernity. And we argue that modernity has given us one thing which is very, very important, and so it's not just been an aberration or a bad development, and that's the concrete singular, the individual self. And this is a true gain of modernity, but of course it has resulted in many oppressive and many oppressive developments that critical realism would want to critique and replace. So that's roughly the philosophical context against which we're in relation to which critical realism and its latest phase, a philosophy of meta-reality, developed. Now, when just before meta-reality developed, I wrote From East to West, and this scandalized most of my fellow critical realists by talking about religious themes and spirituality. The philosophy of meta-reality is secular, but maintains some of what was established in From East to West, transcendental dialectical critical realism about religion, which I briefly want to talk about. What it does is it invokes what I call the Holy Trinity of basic critical realism, which is the compatibility and necessity for each of ontological realism, epistemological relativism, and judgmental rationality, and situates this as a context for talking about religion, and particularly comparative religion. So we can see comparative, the different religions, as being attempts to characterize the access to characterize the absolute in different ways. And of course, different interpretations of a particular religion, like Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, etc., are precisely that, different interpretations of the tradition inaugurated by Jesus Christ. So this framework now is pretty widely accepted for understanding religion and religious education, and that is a very positive gain, I think. Now, I was at pains to distinguish spirituality from religion, and I saw spirituality as characteristic not only of religious projects, but of all great emancipatory projects. And then, by the time the metaReality books were written, I saw it as characteristic of everyday life. So this metareal level was a level of spirituality within social ontology. I haven't really got enough time to say much more about it, but taking up now the points I made at the end of the first section about the extension of the dialectic of freedom and the deepening social ontology, we can think briefly about how metaReality, what metaReality would have to say about the crises on all four planes of contemporary social being. So what sort of resources could metaReality bring to bear? Now, if you take the level of the social structure, remember the four planes: material transactions with nature, social interactions between people, the social structure, and the stratification of the embodied personality. So let's just look at social structure first. Well, economic crisis. So we had a fiscal financial crisis. So it's arguable that what needs to happen is money and the financial structures need to be re-embedded within what could be called the real economy of people working and producing goods and services which are valued by other people. And that real economy has to be re-embedded within its social presuppositions, that is, within the social structure. Has to be re-embedded and democratized within the social structure. And further, that society and the social structure, social and political structure, has to be re-embedded within the spirituality which underpins it. And so this gives us a striking vision of going down to the ground state and the metareal level as the way we want to travel in tackling problems at the level of the social structure. Now, if we look at ecology, another huge source of crisis at the level of material transactions with nature, I think it is absolutely unarguable that what we need is, from the point of view of the planet as a whole, less growth. That is degrowth. And degrowth coupled with a radical redistribution of income. So, in fact, it's probably only the very well-off who would be suffering any fall in their actual standards of material income. And this combination of degrowth, this idea of degrowth, would be associated with the idea of a simplification of social existence. We might think of all the things that we don't do. If you think about it, I know some of my friends in Australia and the States are listening, and some will come to the conference, which we're holding in a couple of weeks, and that's really great. But do we need to actually go to Australia to experience it? We can see it on film, on video. We can talk to our Australian friends, and we can phone them, Skype with them. We can also imagine, creatively visualize what that would be like. And do we need to go to the Grand Canyon physically? I think not. And I think what we'd be doing is developing capacities that we have of creative visualization and communication that we've got lazy about developing. This would be sort of interior growth, simplification, and shedding. These are things which would be associated with the basic model of the self that metaReality puts forward. Because metaReality is not saying that you have to become something radically different from what you are. metaReality is saying you are what you are, and what you are is great, but you're also a lot of other things, and that's what you have to shed. I mean, of course, this is maybe culturally a very difficult thing to implement, this regime of shedding and degrowth. But and of course we're only arguing that it should happen together with a huge redistribution of resources, wealth, and opportunities in a far more egalitarian direction. Now, just briefly to look at sort of metaReality insights on the plane of interactions. Yes, we do understand. We have to understand the other, but of course we can deepen our understanding of the other through the practice of empathy, which I'll come on to when I talk about conflict resolution. And then there's the stratification of the embodied personality. What we would be seeking here is new levels and forms of integration that place the ground state in the center of the self and allow us to work around and gradually get rid of all the non-ground state things and so to become more efficient agents for our own well-being and the well-being of all. Now I want to say something about conflict resolution and peace. So metaReality puts forward two axioms or principles. The first is the principle of universal solidarity. And this says that anyone can, in principle, understand anyone else. And secondly, the second principle is axial rationality, which says that in relation to any human conflict, interhuman conflict, there is always an optimal solution which can be arrived at. So let me motivate the principle of universal solidarity a bit. What it says is that you can, in principle, understand anyone else, even if you vehemently disagree or dislike them. If you think about it, if you have an enemy, what you really need to manipulate your life in the best possible way in relation to this enemy is what you need to know is what you need is information about them. You need intelligence. You need to know what they're thinking, what they're planning, what they are doing. So arguably it was the superior intelligence of the Allies in the Second World War that eventually allowed them to establish a victory. So this is saying that, you know, in principle you ought to be able to understand Hitler, even though you completely abhor everything he does. And understanding Hitler, in fact, will be strategically and tactically the best way of dealing with him. So we shouldn't demonize the terrorists and forget about them. What we have to do is understand them, understand why they're terrorists, why they feel that way. That's a principle of social science. Now, of course, we find it very difficult to understand many other people, particularly people from different cultures and with different norms to ourselves. So let me try and justify it by a thought experiment. So what I'd like you to do is to go back in your thought to the day you were born. And imagine the day before your parents had taken a trip from England or from New England or California or New South Wales, wherever you are or were born, to somewhere very different, to Saudi Arabia or Japan. You would have grown up as a very different person. You would have spoken a different language as effortlessly as you speak English now, or whatever language you do speak. You would have worn different clothes, played different games, and had many different beliefs. And even if, as a result of processes of rational argument and persuasion, you came to exactly the same beliefs as you have now, you would have come to them by a very different route. And what I suggest this experiment proves or suggests is that we can become one with very different people, people who are very different from ourselves. We can become one with the others, with the other. So that is universal solidarity. Axial rationality uh, is established or begins to be justified by realizing that we all live in a material object world. There are certain things that we all have to do to survive. We have to cook. We have to feed our children. And when they grow up, they will learn how to use computers and send emails, but they'll also learn how to use rifles and fire them. And it's an extraordinary thing that you don't have societies which can't fire rifles or can't use or don't use emails. And these things are not obvious. So in every society, I claim there is there must be a process of learning involving critique and self-correction. That must be present in all societies. And that gives you a resource for criticizing self-criticism, for criticizing and transformatively developing your own society. Now, these two principles are very, very important when it comes to conflict resolution. The most important thing to understand about the one you're having conflict with is that they are a human being pretty much like you. So in the case of military conflict, wars are fought with the other given a non-human name like Jerry or Uniform or Frog, because the truth that they're a human being like you is in a way too terrible to take on board. This is the first thing one has to do in moving towards any peace negotiations, or is to understand the other as like oneself, and then eventually you will understand the other and yourself as in a situation or relationship, a transcendental identification, working on common projects, and then ultimately you will see the other as indeed part of yourself. And eventually you will see the other, and you will be able to look back on your experience of the other as being a part of yourself that you hadn't developed, a part of yourself that you hadn't recognized. And that will be a tremendously liberating and de-alienating moment for yourself and your other. Now, in the case of learning, this is very, very interesting. Let me first of all relate learning to emancipation. There's something that's very important to understand, which is that you cannot emancipate anyone else. At the end of the day, emancipation is always self-emancipation. You can go to prison, unlock all the doors, but eventually the prisoner has to come out. Of course, you can help and aid that process of emancipation, but the last step has to be taken by the person who would be emancipated, or who is to be emancipated. Now, in exactly the same way, I could say, well, you can't teach anyone but yourself, because I could put on a whiteboard or blackboard a logical theorem which attempts to show how, if you have P implies Q, and if you have if P and Q, then you can say if P then Q. But of course, if you don't understand that, if you don't see how that works, then that's absolutely useless. So I could put on the board another theorem. If you don't get that, then it's like Wittgenstein said. Mathematics can't come and grab you by the throat. You have to understand it. There has to be that eureka, that aha moment, that now I see it moment. And that is what the educator, that is what the teacher is always working towards. Now, if you look at a typical learning of something, whether it's a language like French or a skill like riding a bicycle, you can make out various phases. The first phase is when you can't do it. When you get on the bike, you fall off. And then comes the aha, or I see it, or I get it. When you can stay on the bike for a bit, or you can speak 1 or 2 sentences of French. And then comes the interesting phase when you're learning how to ride a bike, or you learn how to ride it in different conditions, or if it's a car and you're learning how to drive a car, you learn which way you have to turn the wheel when you're reversing, how to do hill starts, and what to do when you the roads are icy, etc. And then eventually you get to a point magically where you can just do it. And this whole process, metaReality describes as unfolding the unfolded, because you have that within you, that possibility of speaking French, or riding a bike, or knowing how to drive within you. And the process of education, of learning, is a process of your unfolding under the best possible conditions, ideally, the implicit knowledge that you have. And this brings to education something of a Platonic element. Plato had the theory of anamnesis, which was the theory that we have to unforget in order to know something, because we did know it. No, metaReality is not knowing, it's not arguing that you do actually know how to speak French if you don't. All it's saying is that it's a very learner-centered philosophical approach, that you have the potential to speak French, and the process of education is the process of unfolding that capacity which you have, that possibility. And these different stages of a typical dialectic of learning correspond to stages of creation. And the first stage is the stage in which you decide you want to do something, and that is called traditionally the circle of calling. And then the second stage, in which I see it for the first time, that is called the cycle of creativity proper. And then the third stage is the cycle of formation. The fourth stage is the cycle of making, when you can actually do things without thinking about them. You see, the third stage, the level of formation, your head is full of a whole lot of rules. Now, when I construct a sentence in French, I have to do this, that, and the other. Or when I reverse a car, I have to do X, Y, Z. At the fourth stage, when you can just do things spontaneously, the knowledge is inbuilt. It's part of your being. It's not rattling around in your head. And then the fifth stage is seeing your intentionality as reflected in the world. Right? You've actually driven all the way to, I don't know, New York or San Francisco or Sydney or wherever. And you've actually written a letter in French, or you've actually sent an email, or fired a rifle in the air for that matter. Your intentionality is being reflected. So I'm going to have to wind up now, because I think we're going to be removed from this room. I would like to have said something about the limitations of the discursive intellect, the intellect which is concerned with thinking. Because thinking virtually never takes you to the solution. It's a necessary condition for it. You go through all the possibilities. But what happens when you arrive at a solution of a problem is you arrive by the action of another part of your mind or consciousness, which is above, beyond, or beneath thought. Sometimes in the West it's called the unconscious. The unconscious clearly comes into it. It could be also seen as supramental consciousness. It comes from unthought. And this is a topic, however, that I suggest, if you want to follow it up, you read in From Science to Emancipation, or the Philosophy of Meta-Reality. And then I have not time for the most wonderful topic of all, which is the topic of love. And the vision of meta-reality is very much that love is the cement of the universe, that love is the great binding force, and that what we need to love when we're loving someone is love their ground state. And when we have ground state loving ground state, then we have love loving love. And love can love love in ever-widening circles. So, having said that, just add the important point that love is not a form of behavior. So it's not saying that love everyone doesn't mean sleep with everyone, for instance. It doesn't mean hug everyone. You treat each person according to what their higher self would want. Okay, well, thank you very much, Gary, for putting this on. I'm going to wind up now.
Thank you, Roy. I have lots to say as this is the ending, and then Roy spoke about both and the fact that we haven't had time to speak about both. And it suddenly struck me that this whole process that we've been engaged in, that Roy and I have been engaged in since almost January now, has been a process of love, in that it's a love of wanting to know what is there, and then once we've got a handle on what is there, is to share it with people. For me, it was first seeing Roy speak 3 years ago now, and then beginning to read his work and then meeting Roy, to realise that it is love that prevails everything, that everything that we've been speaking about over these 3 sessions is about love. It's about absensing things in ourselves so that we can get more to that totality of love. And then it's also about once we've accessed that love within ourselves, the totality, we ask ourselves, well, what are we going to do with it? We want our own emancipation, but our emancipation is built on the emancipation of others. So it seems that at the end of the day, the calling is to free ourselves by freeing each other. And if that's the underpinning of love, then I think it's a wonderful gesture of love. I'd like to thank Roy for giving his time freely. It's been brilliant. I'd like to thank Rebecca for supporting Roy in all that she's been able to do to get Roy to the screen. I'd say it was Donald who pushed me to do this, and Donald's always been there quietly, sitting there watching what's going on, and if it wasn't for Donald, we wouldn't have the streams that we have had. The IOE have been brilliant in giving us all the services for free, and Paul, the virtual learning coordinator who manages the Blackboard, has been brilliant in tutoring Donald and myself in using the system. We think we understand it now, and because we think we understand it now, what we'd like to do, if possible, in August or September, is expand this so that what we're able to do is not just have you there typing in the chat box, but maybe have you there speaking, and also maybe have you there on video. So what we would like to do is get some sort of dialogue for that, but we'll think about that after the conference. The conference is a wonderful opportunity to come and meet critical realist people. By having experienced the 6 hours of the delivery that Roy's been doing, you should have a feel of what critical realism is about. I attended the critical realism conference last year, not knowing very much about critical realism, and also attempted to do a presentation on the way in which I use critical realism. And Roy attended, and the feedback I got from people was wonderful. It's a great event. It's taking place from the 16th and 18th, there's a kind of introduction to critical realism. You're able to attend, and then the conference runs from the 18th to the 21st. It's here in the IOE, so it's in central London, so it's easy to get to, and it would be great to see people here if you're able to get there. Thank you very much for attending. The chat room's open, so you're welcome to put in you're welcome to chat and say your goodbyes, and we'll leave the chat room open for as long as possible. But the IOE want us to leave now. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you all soon. Take care. Bye.